He glared at me fiercely and said, "Don't you dare love me and leave me. Take him away," I ordered expressionlessly. "His Majesty is drunk and not in his right mind." Xia Xiling clung to the doorframe, refusing to leave, and even tried to threaten me. "Qiaozhen, if you drive me away today, don't regret it later." I sat at the table flipping through a book, unmoved. The situation became awkward for a moment, suddenly softening his tone again. His eyes reddened as he came over to tug at my sleeve with a pitiful expression. "All right, honey, I regret it now." Hello, everyone, welcome to my channel. Subscribe us to read wonderful novels every day. Now the story begins. After Xia Xiling sobered up, he completely changed his tune, claiming he was now a mature emperor and that last night's coquettish behavior was just an accident, telling me not to take it to heart. I smiled very kindly. "Your Majesty is absolutely right. Yesterday, Consort Shu sent someone to report that she wasn't feeling well. Perhaps Your Majesty could visit her after court." His expression darkened. "Is the Empress so eager to drive me away?" I choked up, speechless. "Isn't this exactly what you meant?" Yet I couldn't drop the demeanor of a noble lady, so I maintained a gentle smile. "Expanding the royal lineage is Your Majesty's duty. As the Empress of this nation, it is my responsibility to advise." "Empress." Xia Xiling looked at me with both anger and resentment. After a long pause, he suddenly gritted his teeth and dismissed all the palace attendants. "All of you, leave. I wish to speak with the Empress alone." Then, while I was still utterly bewildered, he suddenly reached out, undid the half-fastened silk skirt I was wearing, grabbed my undergarment, leaned over, and bit down on my lips. I stiffened. "Your Majesty, are you a dog?" Xia Xiling let out a mocking laugh. "Honey's mouth is so stubborn. Yet her body has gone utterly limp." Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that 17-year-old Xia Xiling would utter such vulgar words, leaving me utterly dismayed. "Has Your Majesty forgotten? I held you in my arms when you were just 1 month old." The words that followed were left unspoken. Xia Xiling's long, warm hands trailed down from the protruding butterfly bones of my spine, sending shivers through me. "Help, he's so good at this." Bearing the Emperor's legitimate heir is also the Empress's duty. Noticing the desire shimmering in my eyes like rippling water, he suddenly curled his lips into a smile. "Today is my day off, no court sessions. Take your time enjoying this, honey." That triumphant tone is so childish. I sighed helplessly and stopped resisting, closing my eyes. "Silly child, he's young, enduring, and full of energy, perfectly compatible with me. Not enjoying life to the fullest is the real waste." Xia Xiling and I grew up together as childhood sweethearts. I am the legitimate daughter of a grand secretary, while he is the crown prince. We've been together since childhood, though I am 5 years his senior. I held Xia Xiling in my arms when he was just a month old. When he first began to speak, I was learning embroidery, and by the time Xia Xiling had made modest achievements under the late emperor's tutelage, my parents were already arranging a marriage for me. By then, the late emperor had been gravely ill for a long time, and the court was unsettled. If not for Chancellor Yan Xuanting's resolute efforts to push Xia Xiling to the throne against all opposition, the empire might have changed hands. When Xia Xiling came to see me at the scholar's mansion, his eyes were red. "Honey, are you getting married?" I turned my head away and coughed twice before answering honestly, "I'm afraid it won't happen. I fell ill. At first it was just a common cold. But then the fever wouldn't break, leaving me bedridden for over 2 months." Seeing my condition, the family I was betrothed to hastily came to discuss breaking off the engagement. They said falling so gravely ill before even marrying into their family proved my constitution was too weak to bear them heirs. The broken engagement somehow became the talk of every noble household in the capital. Thus my marriage prospects were indefinitely postponed. By the time I turned 20, my parents decided they could wait no longer. Lowering their standards, they arranged another match for me, this time with the illegitimate eldest son of the Vice Minister of Personnel. Rumor had it his looks were rather unfortunate, which explained why he remained unmarried past 20. The marriage was settled, but just 1 month later, the Vice Minister of Personnel was suddenly imprisoned for accepting bribes and involvement in selling official positions. my engagement was off again. My reputation had already taken quite a hit, and I had resigned myself to a life of solitude, accompanied only by the dim light of Buddhist lamps. To my utter surprise, Xia Xiling suddenly sent an imperial edict to the scholar's mansion, declaring his intention to make me his empress. I was stunned, so were my parents, marrying Xia Xiling, who was 5 years my junior, and becoming empress at that. This was something I wouldn't have dared to dream of. The eunuch Cui delivering the imperial decree smiled with narrowed eyes. His Majesty is currently discussing state affairs with Minister Yan in the palace and will come to visit Miss Qiao shortly. Truth be told, I hadn't seen Xia Xiling for nearly half a year. To my surprise, he had already grown so tall. When he arrived, he wore only a light blue brocade robe, a young man as elegant as orchids and jade trees, his face resembling a vividly painted portrait. Though weariness lingered between his brows, it couldn't conceal his sharp and cold demeanor. His lips were pressed tightly together, with ink stains still splattered across his knuckles. Seeing me, Xia Xiling froze for a moment before his expression suddenly relaxed. I walked over, bowed, and then asked, "Why did your Majesty think of making me the Empress?" Xia Xiling opened his mouth as if about to say something, but his gaze fell behind me and he suddenly stopped. Then he said, "Naturally, because, honey, you are the most suitable candidate." I turned to see that my parents had also come forward. According to etiquette, an unmarried maiden should not be present during marriage negotiations. I calmly took my leave with proper courtesy, then immediately detoured to the rear window after exiting, and began eavesdropping. We have been on the throne for over 3 years now, and court ministers have repeatedly petitioned for the early establishment of an empress. But with unrest still unsettled, how could we set our mind at ease? Minister Qiao was a trusted pillar of our late father's court. We naturally place full confidence in you. Moreover, we grew up with honey since childhood and know her roots thoroughly. I understand, though my father holds the prestigious position of Grand Secretary, ranked first-grade official, he wields little actual power. For me to become this empress is most fitting indeed. With 2 broken engagements behind me, remarrying would be as difficult as climbing to heaven. Becoming empress is already the best possible outcome, and so, the Imperial Astronomical Bureau selected an auspicious day, and Xia Xiling and I were married, dressed in phoenix crown and red bridal robes. I sat in the bridal sedan chair as the 10-mile-long procession of dowry made its way into the palace. Then Xia Xiling appeared, and we performed the wedding ceremony before retiring to the bridal chamber. When the red veil was lifted, I meekly raised my eyes to look at him, silently repeating to myself 3 times, "I shall be a virtuous empress." He was only 17, his harem still empty, and he had yet to experience the affairs of men and women. Both of us possessed only shallow theoretical knowledge, clumsily fumbling our way through practice beneath the bed curtains. Outside, the wedding candles burned bright as garments were shed one by one. When Xia Xiling had undressed me down to a single red undergarment embroidered with phoenixes, his expression suddenly grew tense. Truth be told, I was nervous too. But as the virtuous empress, I had to offer reassurance. "Your Majesty need not panic, let us take it slowly." Then Xia Xiling suddenly became displeased. He bit down hard near my ear, sending waves of pain and tingling through me. I gasped sharply, only to hear him whisper, "This emperor insists on coming quickly. Damn it, this kid is so rebellious." The pain made me furrow my brows, but remembering the nanny's instructions, I didn't dare make a sound. Xia Xiling looked up and, seeing my furrowed brows, suddenly softened his expression. Kissing my lips gently, he murmured, "Does it hurt, honey? Then this emperor will go slower." After all the commotion, I was completely exhausted, just as I was drifting off to sleep in a daze. I suddenly felt him grab my hand firmly, press his lips to my forehead, and murmur in a low voice, "Qiaozhen, I've finally married you." His voice was filled with relief and tenderness, even carrying a hint of deep sigh. Not at all like the awkward child Xia Xiling I still saw in my eyes, but perhaps I misheard, because just in the 2nd month after I became empress, Xia Xiling suddenly came to me one day after the morning court session and threw a thick ledger at me. I was halfway through my morning meal and hurriedly stood up to bow. He frowned, his voice inexplicably displeased. The Empress need not stand on ceremony. I picked up the booklet on the table and flipped through it. Good heavens! It was filled with beauties of all shapes and styles, each accompanied by their names and backgrounds. Your Majesty, this is, truth be told, I had some idea, but not the full picture yet. Or perhaps I was still hoping Xia Xiling would say something that completely contradicted my suspicions. Xia Xiling sat down across from me, took a sip of soup, then looked at me earnestly. I shall select concubines, men, I knew it. I nearly slapped this registry book right across his face, forcing a slight curve at the corners of my lips. I attempted to dissuade him. Your Majesty is still young at present. The matter of selecting concubines should perhaps be carefully considered. Xia Xiling's face darkened as he interrupted me stiffly. The Empress need not persuade me further. My decision is final. Fine, I'll shut up. Obediently, I said, this concubine will make arrangements at once. But may I ask what kind of woman your Majesty prefers? Gentle and lovely, intelligent and gracious. Xia Xiling's gaze suddenly paused on me, just like the Empress. Who would have thought that Xia Xiling, despite his young age, shared the same taste as those old-fashioned ministers in their 70s and 80s at court, preferring virtuous and gentle women? I scoffed at it, but still arranged for him, selecting over a dozen mild-tempered girls to enter the palace. I drafted titles and residences for them according to their father's official ranks and presented them to Xia Xiling for approval, yet suddenly, he seemed indifferent again. With just a glance, he brushed aside those pages of paper, instead hooking his arm around my waist and pulling me into the bed curtains with him. As a virtuous Empress, I continued to admonish him. Your Majesty, indulging in lust during daylight hours is somewhat improper. Xia Xiling didn't engage in our usual verbal sparring this time. Instead, he closed his eyes and buried his face in the crook of my shoulder. Honey, I feel so tired. My movements stilled as my fingers came to rest on his back in a soothing gesture, giving him a gentle pat. Xia Xiling had been occupied with court affairs while I'd been busy selecting candidates. We hadn't seen each other for several days. I hadn't realized he'd grown so much thinner. When he was 6 years old, the late Empress passed away. When I went to the palace to pay my respects, he was kneeling before her coffin. Upon seeing me, he stumbled over and buried his pale little face in my shoulder, his voice still choked with sobs. Honey, I don't have a mother anymore, I sighed inwardly. Forget it. After all, Xia Xiling was 5 years younger than me, essentially still a child. I was already a mature Empress. Why should I hold it against him? Chancellor Yen has shown me great kindness, but ultimately, his excessive power is not beneficial to me. Xia Xiling murmured, Honey, I often feel that in matters concerning Chancellor Yen, I've been too ungrateful. To be honest, I think so too, but when a ruler engages in political maneuvering, it's inevitable to wrong one or two people. After some thought, I offered comfort and advice. The art of checks and balances should be practiced this way, especially since Your Majesty has always relied heavily on Chancellor Yen. If you truly feel guilty, perhaps you could compensate him in other ways. Xia Xiling fell silent for a moment. Honey speaks most wisely. Then the very next day, I heard he had arranged a marriage for Yen Xianting, reportedly to the younger sister of Prince Jing'an, named Shen Manman. Her portrait and profile were also in that book. She was quite beautiful in appearance, but her temperament was excessively venomous, and it seemed she had some rather improper relationship with her own brother. Where's the compensation you promised? What kind of grudge is this? The day the imperial consorts entered the palace happened to be the 15th of the month. According to palace regulations, Xia Xiling should have stayed in my quarters that night. But the newly arrived virtuous consort, her father had recently gained Xia Xiling's favor, and she reaped the benefits, becoming the first of the new consorts to receive the emperor's attention. My heart wasn't without sorrow. Yet I understood clearly that this was the torment a queen must endure, so I instructed Chen Ying to serve dinner, planning to retire early after the meal. Unexpectedly, Halfway through the meal, Xia Xiling actually arrived, dressed impeccably, without a trace of cosmetic fragrance about him. Before I could ask, he had already volunteered the information. Virtuous consort is ill and has retired for the evening. It occurred to me that I haven't seen the Empress in quite some time, so I came to visit. With that, he took the initiative to sit down for dinner and even asked Chenying to serve him a bowl of rice. Your Majesty, if my memory serves me right. We slept together just last night. It's just that my monthly courses hadn't finished yesterday, so we didn't perform the rites of Zhou Gong. Xia Xiling choked on his words, set down his chopsticks, and looked at me with apparent displeasure. Does my honey not wish for me to come? I smiled politely. If your Majesty comes, this concubine is naturally overjoyed. All of you, leave us. Xia Xiling huffily dismissed the palace attendants, then grabbed my wrist and pressed closer. Before I could react, he scooped me up and rolled onto the bed with me. The skirt made of delicate silk gauze was slipped off, and ink-scented slender fingers crept beneath the edge of my undergarments. Grasping a handful, I gasped slightly, then heard Xia Xiling's voice whisper close to my ear, "Has honey's monthly courses ended, you?" He bit my chest, then raised his head, his eyes suddenly darkening with deep desire. "Honey, I've missed you," all because of Xia Xiling's single sentence. We tangled until late at night, making love 3 times. In such matters, we had gradually attuned ourselves to each other through practice, making us exceptionally well-matched. But at the height of passion, a voice in my heart reminds me that this young and fervent Xia Xiling does not belong to me alone. It's not that I truly wish to be virtuous, gentle, and magnanimous. It's just that my mother taught me countless times that a woman must be generous and virtuous to win her husband's favor. Even though her relationship with my father was so strong, he still took 2 concubines. As the ruler of a nation, Xia Xiling cannot even speak of loyalty and chastity. What has always been like this? If it doesn't belong to me alone, I'd rather not have it. A sudden thought tore through my heart with a dull ache. Xia Xiling paused, his voice softening abruptly. "Honey, are you crying?" His fingers, soft yet scorching, gently brushed the corner of my eye. I suppressed my turbulent thoughts and praised, "This concubine weeps not from sorrow, but from awe of your Majesty's prowess." In the dim candlelight, Xia Xiling's face actually flushed slightly red. He gripped my fingers and softly called out, "Honey." The voice was sticky sweet, laced with 3 parts desire, nearly melting my heart with its call. I closed my eyes. The allure of men is truly perilous. Xia Xiling, the dignified ruler of a nation, actually resorted to using seduction tactics. The next morning, Xia Xiling left early for court, while I lingered in bed for a while. Soon after, Chenying came in to announce that the imperial consorts had arrived to pay their respects. By the time I arrived, the room was already filled with a bevy of beauties. However, thanks to Xia Xiling's preferences and my screening, only gentle-natured girls were admitted. Those who observed proper etiquette, spoke softly, and got along harmoniously, except for Consortly. The register described her as the illegitimate daughter of the Grand Tutor's family, stunningly beautiful and gentle in temperament. Who would have thought this little girl had 2 faces? After leaving me, she happened to run into Xia Xiling in the imperial garden just as he was returning from court. According to eyewitnesses, Consortly quickened her pace on the spot, then went limp and collapsed into Xia Xiling's arms, cooing in a sickly sweet voice, "This humble consort greets your Majesty." The eyewitnesses also reported that Xia Xiling immediately pushed her away, dodging to the side like a startled rabbit while frowning and asking, "Are you out of your mind?" Before Xia Xiling could arrive, the other party involved, Consortly, had already come to me clutching a handkerchief, weeping and wailing, Your servant never meant to disturb His Majesty, nor to offend Her Majesty the Empress." She wore a moon-white blouse and skirt, her tearful appearance resembling a delicate flower in the rain. "Now that His Majesty has cast me aside, what am I to do?" I sipped my tea and watched her performance. After crying for a while and realizing I remained unmoved, Consortly paused briefly before continuing. "Could your Majesty help your servant think of a solution?" I said gently. Consortly, What you may not realize is that His Majesty prefers gentle and virtuous women. Your behavior in the Imperial Garden earlier was rather bold, so it's no surprise you didn't win his favor." Consortly looked at me with skeptical eyes. "You may return now and copy women's virtues and admonitions for women 50 times each." Consortly was furious but dared not speak out. With tears in her eyes, she accepted the order and turned to leave, only to bump into Xie Xiling, who was just stepping through the door. I finally witnessed the legendary Xie Xiling leaping away like a startled rabbit. Consortly, who had instinctively wanted to lean against him, could only awkwardly straighten her posture. Tears still glistened in her beautiful eyes as she said, "This concubine takes her leave." But Xie Xiling had already averted his gaze, missing her pitiful and delicate appearance. I watched with great interest for a while, only snapping back to reality when Xie Xiling approached me. "Your Majesty, why have you come so early today?" Xie Xiling paused, his expression suddenly turning grave. "Xiao Jin has returned." I was momentarily stunned. Xiao Jin, the heir of the Marquis of Anyang, could be considered Xie Xiling's and my childhood friend. He had followed the Marquis to the southwestern fiefdom a year before Xie Xiling ascended the throne, and in the blink of an eye, 5 years had passed. The next day, Xiao Jin entered the palace to see me and sighed deeply. Though the position of Empress commands the respect of the realm, His Majesty is still just a child at heart. I smiled gently. To His Majesty, I was the best choice at that time, and to me, he was likewise the same. As we spoke, Xie Xiling stormed in with a dark expression and immediately began shooing Xiao Jin away. "It's getting late. The heir should leave the palace now." I held back but couldn't resist saying, "Your Majesty, it's been so long since I last saw the heir. Could we not speak a few more words?" No, I wanted to slap Xie Xiling, brat. In the end, Xiao Jin bowed and took his leave, promising to bring me the pastries I loved from outside the palace on his next visit. After he left, Xie Xiling remained seated at the table with a cold expression. I didn't feel like coaxing him, so I simply sat with him, smiling. Finally, Xie Xiling spoke. "Honey, do you remember, my 18th birthday is approaching?" He emphasized the words 18th birthday with particular weight. I paused, taken aback. "But isn't that still 7 months away?" Xie Xiling's expression softened slightly, but he still wasn't entirely pleased. "When we say we're almost there, we're almost there." I could barely suppress my laughter. "As long as Your Majesty is happy." Xie Xiling was clearly displeased, because after I said this, he immediately turned and left in a huff. That evening, Xie Xiling chose Consort De's name tablet for his nightly visit. For 7 consecutive days thereafter, he kept summoning Consort D to his chambers, until Consort Li was found crouching daily in the grass outside Consort De's palace, waiting for Xie Xiling. I expressed admiration for Consort Li's persistence and issued an edict ordering her to copy the palace regulations 50 more times. That day, news arrived from the court. Floods had struck the southern provinces, and Prime Minister Yan Shueding requested permission to investigate the Ji River embankments. Accompanying him for protection was an elite troop under the command of Consort De's father, General Xuanwu. At last I understood Xie Xiling's intention, but I could never be like Consort Li. Xie Xiling's actions only made me realize once again with painful clarity that he was, after all, the emperor. He could never be my Xie Xiling alone. Unpredictability and the constant fear of loss, this was the natural order of things. I awoke from the illusion brought by those past tendernesses and affections, even the years of childhood companionship. That evening, when Xie Xiling came to my chambers, I received him with polite yet distant courtesy, my conduct impeccable in every detail. Yet when he sought intimacy with me, I couldn't help but lose control and push him away. Xie Xiling froze momentarily before growing visibly agitated. "What does honey mean by this? Are you unwilling to be close to your emperor? It's been so long since Your Majesty last visited. This concubine has grown unfamiliar with you." I smiled with perfect decorum, proactively removing my outer robe and undergarments. "Your Majesty may proceed." Xie Xiling stared at me with almost savage intensity. the corners of his eyes slightly reddened. His fingertips brushed across my bare shoulder as he conjured a smile heavy with dark desire. Honey should rest early, this emperor will go see consort da. I kicked Xie Xiling off the bed with one foot. I thought Xie Xiling would be angry, but to my surprise, he rolled over and sat up, his eyes sparkling as he looked at me. I'm going to consort this place. Are you unhappy about that, honey? How could I be? I adjusted my collar and thought for a moment. It's just that consort day has been favored for many nights now. If the imperial favor is unevenly distributed, it might stir discontent among the others. Why doesn't your majesty visit consort Shu's palace instead? In the end, Xie Xiling didn't go anywhere, but he didn't touch me either. Instead, he called for Chunying to bring another quilt and slept far away from me. Before going to bed, he glared at me with gritted teeth. I never knew my honey could be so magnanimous. I closed my eyes, hiding my emotions. Your majesty jests. If not for my virtue, how could your majesty have made me your empress? The days grew hotter, yet Xie Xiling and I inexplicably fell into a cold war. Coinciding with his busy court affairs, he simply stopped visiting the inner palace for 10 days or even half a month at a time. News continued to arrive from the court. First about Chancellor Yan's injury, followed by the old affair between Chancellor Yan's wife and Prince Jing'an. In the end, Prince Jing'an was stripped of his title and died from poisoning. Chancellor Yan resigned and returned to his hometown. Xie Xiling repeatedly tried to persuade him to stay, eventually keeping him in the court with a powerless official position. This was probably the best outcome Xie Xiling could have hoped for. Thinking of Xie Xiling, who had once wept on my shoulder, I still felt a pang of sympathy. I had Chunying chill a cup of rose cherry wine, planning to bring it to the imperial study to visit him. Approaching the imperial study, I was stopped by eunuch Cui. He offered me an awkward yet polite smile. Your Highness, His Majesty is not in the study, I replied gently. It's all right, just tell me where His Majesty has gone. His Majesty has gone to consort Shu's palace. Eunuch Cui hesitated. His Majesty also said. He went on Her Majesty the Empress's advice. My smile remained unchanged. Understood. Thank you for your trouble, Eunuch Cui. Then I returned to my quarters with Chunying and finished the entire bowl of rose-flavored cherries that had already melted to lukewarm. Chunying tried to comfort me. Your Majesty must not grieve. I shook my head. Chunying, at home, I was Qiaojin, the legitimate daughter of the Grand Secretary. In the palace, I am the Empress. In neither identity should I feel sorrow. I have always been clear-headed. That was Xie Xiling, the youth who gathered me an armful of camellias when I was 17, and now, the emperor who sits high upon the dragon throne, decisive in action yet cautious and suspicious by nature. His heart, the way he looks at me with his eyes, has always been veiled in mist, leaving me unable to see clearly. Perhaps there was affection, but it was elusive and inconsistent. In that case, I simply won't take it anymore. By the time of Xie Xiling's birthday, it was already the depths of winter. He came to my palace early in the morning, hinting in a roundabout way for a gift. Even at 18, he's still the same as when he was a child. I had Chunying fetch the piece of green jade I'd personally carved. Xie Xiling fiddled with it for ages before finally offering a perfunctory comment. The craftsmanship isn't bad. That tone of his makes me want to hit him, I said expressionlessly. Your Majesty needn't force yourself. If you don't like it, just return it. Xie Xiling immediately tucked it into his robe. Who said I don't like it? I absolutely adore it. I was satisfied, even though we were still in the midst of a cold war. I had to admit Xie Xiling was a good emperor. His 18th birthday wasn't lavishly celebrated, just a simple meal in my palace, with the concubines from various palaces sending rather conventional gifts. Only the ever-persistent consort Li, braving the heavy snow in flimsy garments, requested an audience outside the door, claiming she wanted to perform a dance for His Majesty. The moment I allowed her inside, I glanced at Xie Xiling and noticed his expression had turned somewhat frosty. Consort Li wore a red dress, her bare ankles adorned with golden bells. She knelt in the room with a graceful bow, but before she could speak, Xie Xiling coldly rebuked, no manners at all. With that, he flicked his sleeve and retreated into the inner chamber. Consort Li looked at me with tearful eyes, and I could only sigh. I've told you before, the emperor only favors virtuous and gentle women, yet you refuse to listen. It was this concubine's ignorance. Now I've incurred his majesty's displeasure again. She sobbed for a while before bowing to me once more. Thank you for your guidance, Empress. This concubine understands what must be done from now on. I had Chunying fetch a thick cloak and draped it over her before sending her off. After all this commotion, I lost interest in celebrating Xie Ziling's birthday. Holding my cup, I sat alone at the table drinking tea. Eventually, he sidled over and sat across from me, hinting that he wanted to go outside the palace for a stroll. Remembering the palace-exclusive pastries and dishes I hadn't tasted in ages, I agreed, just as the imperial palanquin approached the palace gate. A palace attendant hurriedly came to report that the newly appointed prime minister had urgent matters to discuss and was currently waiting for Xie Ziling in the imperial study. The words were spoken in haste, suggesting there truly was something pressing. I instinctively wanted to tell Xie Ziling not to go, but when I opened my mouth, the usual words came out. If that's the case, Your Majesty should go quickly to attend to it. State affairs take precedence. Xie Ziling looked at me. The sharp wind and snow howled past my ears. He seemed to want to say something, but in the end, he merely nodded and said calmly, I shall attend to state affairs first. The weather is bitterly cold with heavy snow, and the palace outskirts are not entirely safe. The Empress should return to the scholar's residence for now. After Xie Ziling left, I went home. Outside, the fierce wind and snow battered against the window frames, while inside, the charcoal fire burned brightly. I poked at the charcoal fire with a long silver skewer, lost in thought. My mother sat across from me, carefully peeling an orange with a handkerchief, then patiently using a silver hairpin to remove the white pith before handing it to me. I asked her, Where's father? Concubine Bai's family member fell ill. I had the storeroom prepare some medicinal herbs, and your father accompanied her to visit them. She looked at me with a wistful smile. I never imagined back then that you'd marry into the imperial family. I never thought about it myself. There's a 5-year age gap between Xie Ziling and me, so by all rights, it shouldn't have been my turn. Xiao Jin visited the manor a couple of days ago. He's still unmarried and would have been the most suitable match for you. I cut her off before she could finish. Mother, mind your words, walls have ears. Her lashes trembled, and suddenly tears fell. You've only been in the palace for a month, and the emperor has already begun selecting new concubines. How could your days be anything but difficult now? I remained silent for a moment before comforting her, saying that Xie Ziling and I treated each other with respect, and most of the consorts knew their place, so it wasn't all that unbearable. I've lived like this for so many years, it's not unbearable, but what hope is there? Ajin, you were quite lively and clever as a child. How is it that as you grew older, you've become even more quiet? I lowered my eyes. It's nothing, I've just grown up. Before marriage, I too had imagined days of marital harmony, but between Xie Ziling and me stood too many barriers: court politics, imperial consorts, and the constraints of our respective statuses. In the end, this was probably all we could hope for. I waited at the chancellor's residence until dusk, when my father finally returned. Aunt Bai greeted me gently before retiring to her courtyard. I was just about to speak with my father when a servant came to report that Xie Ziling had arrived at the scholar's residence to fetch someone. When he entered the room, he was covered in snow and wind. Looking up at him, I suddenly realized how tall he had grown. Xie Ziling wore a cold expression, excused my parents from formal greetings, declined their invitation to stay for dinner, and directly took me back to the palace. On the way back, the wind and snow outside grew increasingly fierce. After a moment's thought, I still asked him, what urgent matter did the Prime Minister discuss with Your Majesty today? This could be considered a peace offering. Xie Ziling's previously tense expression suddenly relaxed. A faint smile curled at the corners of his lips as he looked at me and said, Nothing much. It's just that the remnants of the late Marquis Jing'an's faction still refuse to give up. They've been recruiting troops near Yaocheng. I've already issued an edict ordering General Xuanwu to lead troops to Yaochang and handle the situation. Although the inner palace should not interfere in state affairs, I had heard bits and pieces about Marquis Gingen, Xintungwen, from Xie Ziling before. It was said that the poison in former Prime Minister Yen Xuanting's body had been administered by Xintungwen. Xintungwen's death was indeed related to Yen Xuanting's wife, Yi Shushu. After pondering for a moment, I lowered my head, then raised it again and tentatively asked, since His Majesty now intends to promote General Xuanwu, perhaps the rank of Consort de could be elevated further. Consort de already holds one of the 4 highest consort positions. If she were to be promoted again, she would become an imperial noble consort. Xie Ziling's faint smile immediately vanished. He stared at me, gritting his teeth as he said, "He is a subject, and I am the ruler. It is only natural for me to employ him. Besides, is the Empress truly so magnanimous? I only considered your Majesty's state affairs. Even I didn't believe the tone in which I said those words." Xie Ziling was probably angered. The moment we entered the palace, he decisively jumped off the carriage and said indifferently without turning back, "There's no need for further promotion in rank. However, the Empress does make a valid point. I shall visit Consort de tonight." The narrow path was buried deep in snow and hard to traverse, yet he walked swiftly away without ever looking back. By all rights, I should have bowed to see him off properly, yet when I opened my mouth, my tongue curled into a tight ball inside, the pain nearly robbing me of speech. Returning to my chambers, Chenying asked with concern, "Why is your Highness crying?" I raised a hand and touched cold wetness upon my cheeks. I always said Xie Ziling was difficult. But wasn't I being just as stubborn myself? For the following month, Xie Ziling never set foot in the rear palace again, and naturally, he didn't come to see me either. Chenying often brought back news, like how General Xuanwu led troops to Yaochang to quell the unrest, completely wiping out the remnants of Marquis Gingen's faction, or how Yen Xuanting's sister was about to have a grand wedding, and Xie Ziling specifically attended the ceremony, also settling an old grudge between her and a young master from the Bai family of Keizhou. At night, after Xie Ziling returned to the palace, he came to see me. At that moment, Chenying had just finished brewing the medicine and brought it to me when Xie Ziling strode through the door. Seeing me drinking the medicine, his voice carried a hint of urgency. "What's wrong with the Empress?" "Just a slight chill, nothing serious, Your Majesty. The Empress's cold is quite severe, and her constitution has weakened." The imperial physician insisted that Her Majesty must take the medicine on time. My voice and Chenying's sounded simultaneously. I helplessly massaged my forehead, then turned to scold Chenying. Such a trivial matter. Why bother His Majesty with it? Xie Ziling sat down across from me, slamming his teacup heavily on the table as he said coldly, "Xiaozhen, you wouldn't even tell me about your illness. Did you really plan to never speak to me again?" He no longer referred to himself as Jin, the royal we. Chenying beside me had quietly withdrawn, leaving the room to Xie Ziling and me. I held the thin white porcelain medicine bowl, remained silent for a moment, and finally spoke. "Clearly it's His Majesty who hasn't entered the rear palace these 2 months. How did it end up becoming me not speaking to you?" Only after saying this did I realize my tone was full of resentment, like a neglected wife in the inner chambers. How unsightly. When I was 8 years old, my mother took me back to her maiden home to visit relatives. I have an uncle who took 6 concubines within half a year of marriage. When we arrived, my aunt was weeping and shouting at my uncle, asking if he knew what crime it was to favor concubines over the lawful wife. She cried for a long time before my uncle finally opened the door and said impatiently, "If you think I'm favoring concubines over the wife, then go report me to the authorities." Since ancient times, men have often been fickle in love. At that moment, I thought, how utterly unbecoming. I'd rather have been a virtuous and dignified wife from the very beginning, never giving my heart away, so there'd be nothing to regret when love is lost. I closed my eyes and said hoarsely, "This humble consort has overstepped. Your Majesty should pretend you never heard it." The room fell silent for a breath. Then Xia Xiling suddenly reached out and seized my wrist. Since that's the case, I'll come see the Empress more often from now on, all right. After turning 14, he had rarely softened his voice to speak to me like this. My heart, which I had steeled with such difficulty, softened all at once. After a pause, I still answered softly, all right. The weather grew increasingly hot, and one day, I heard from Chunying that Xia Xiling had actually summoned Yan Xuanting's wife, Yi Shushu, into the palace, recalling how Xia Xiling had vaguely mentioned her background before. I couldn't help but feel curious. The kitchen happened to have 2 chilled rose cherry drinks prepared, so I had Chunying fetch them to bring to Xia Xiling. But the moment I stepped inside, I heard him ask with a darkened face, "Does the lady of Gaoyang County think that I, the emperor, dare not punish you?" Yi Shushu replied expressionlessly, "You dare. Go ahead and punish me then." My heart skipped a beat. I knew this child was stirring up trouble again. Quickly raising my voice, I said, "Your Majesty, reconsider. The Lady of Gaoyang and Lord Yen share a deep affection. Why must your Majesty play the role of separating lovers?" In my haste, my words came out rather blunt. I expected Xia Xiling to be angry, but instead, he turned to me with bright eyes and said, "The Empress speaks wisely." Chunying placed the items on the table, and Xia Xiling rushed over to look. Tugging at my sleeve, he cooed, "Rose cherries." As expected, only my honey knows what I like best. Then he turned his head and shot Yi Shushu a somewhat challenging glance, like a child proudly showing off his favorite toy. I found it both amusing and faintly heartbreaking to watch Xia Xiling down a glass of rose cherry wine in one gulp, before saying gently, "You may return first, Empress. I shall visit you later." That evening, Xia Xiling did indeed come to see me. I had no idea what he and Yi Shushu discussed after I left. Sitting across from me, he drank 3 cups of tea in silence. His expression visibly conflicted. Growing impatient, I asked gently, "Does your Majesty have something to discuss?" Xia Xiling paused for a moment. "I find the Empress's name utterly charming." Me. Xia Xiling pursed his lips and added, "My honey is both beautiful and virtuous, truly adorable." Me. Has Xia Xiling gone mad? Perhaps my reaction was too indifferent, for Xia Xiling narrowed his eyes and suddenly reached out to tug at my collar. "It's getting late," he said. "Let us retire. This emperor and his empress, I don't know if it's my imagination, but he served me with extraordinary attentiveness that night, giving me such intense pleasure that it stirred a rare sense of possessiveness within me. Suddenly, I didn't want Xia Xiling to go to anyone else's palace at all. At dawn, Xia Xiling left for court, and I was carving a piece of jade in my chamber when Chunying suddenly came to report that Xiao Jin had sent 2 cups of sour plum drink from outside the palace, my favorite from a shop I used to frequent before entering the palace. Just as the crystal cup reached my lips, Xia Xiling hurriedly strode in, his sleeve sweeping the cup from my hand. The glass goblet fell to the ground and shattered with a crisp sound. I froze for a moment, then raised my eyes to look at Xia Xiling. My gaze involuntarily turning cold, Xia Xiling seemed stung by my look, gritting his teeth as he said, "How dare you casually consume something sent from outside the palace? This was sent by Xiao Jin." "What does Xiao Jin matter?" Xia Xiling grew even angrier. "Xiaojin, you and I are husband and wife. You keep mentioning Xiao Jin. Do you regret not marrying him instead?" His temper was utterly baffling. I could bear it no longer and said coldly, "Since your Majesty and I are already husband and wife, I beg you to choose your words more carefully. Xiaojin, if given another chance, if Xiao Jin had returned to the capital earlier and come to propose, would you still have married me?" I didn't understand why Xia Xiling would ask such a question. In the brief moment I hesitated, he already said bitterly, "I see." With that, he left without looking back. Coming to my senses, I sent Chunying out to inquire where Xia Xiling had gone and whom he had met that day. Chunying returned quickly, saying that after the morning court session, the emperor had summoned the heir of Anyang Marquis, Xiao Jin, for a private audience in the imperial study. Xiao Jin, what on earth did he say to Xia Xiling that made the child suddenly bring up old matters and look so angry? I was eager to meet Xiao Jin immediately to ask about the situation. But fearing Xie Ziling might grow even angrier, I had no choice but to go and coax him first. A few days later, choosing a day when Xie Ziling didn't have morning court, I went to his palace early in the morning to request an audience. At first, Xie Ziling was still sulking and refused to let me in, but when I stood in the wind and coughed twice, and eunuch Cui went in to relay the message, Xie Ziling immediately had him bring me inside. The palace chamber was dimly lit. Xie Ziling sat at the table, slightly tilting his head to gaze in my direction. I steadied myself and asked, after all this time, has His Majesty's anger subsided? He stubbornly retorted, this emperor is not angry. I walked over, bowed to Xie Ziling, then sat beside him and reached out to hold his hand. The child's face was clearly flushed, yet he scolded, this is improper behavior. All right. I quickly withdrew my hand and sat up straight. As a result, his expression darkened even more. So hard to please, I couldn't be bothered with polite formalities with Xie Ziling and went straight to the point. What exactly did Xiao Jin discuss with the emperor when he entered the palace that day? Xie Ziling's expression suddenly changed, a trace of hidden pain flashing through his eyes. Then, gnashing his teeth, he said, nothing, it's just that when I wanted to arrange a marriage for him, he claimed he already had someone he admired in his heart. He even said that person was already married to another, so it wouldn't be proper for him to entertain such delusions. Oh dear, my first thought was that Xiao Jin was using me as a shield. After all, from childhood till now, I've never noticed any signs of admiration from him towards me. Moreover, I've had 2 marriage proposals rejected in succession before. If he were truly so infatuated with me, how could there have been no action at all? Is your Majesty angry about this matter? I said calmly, but this concubine and the heir of Anyang Marquis are completely innocent. I truly don't know how to clear my name. Xie Ziling gazed at me with deep, unreadable eyes. After a long pause, he suddenly said, that question I asked the Empress that day. Can you give me an answer now? I froze for a moment before realizing what Xie Ziling had asked that day, and immediately replied, now that this humble consort and your Majesty are united as husband and wife. It has nothing to do with others. Moreover, the world is ever-changing. There's no such thing as what if. This consort has never considered such matters. It was a perfectly standard, faultless response, yet Xie Ziling remained unsatisfied. He suddenly stood up, walked over to me, then leaned down until his face was alarmingly close to mine, our noses nearly touching, our heated breaths tangling together. Then he said hoarsely, honey nose, that's not what I wanted to hear. I saw a trace of hidden pain in his eyes that were so close to me, and for a moment, I was lost in thought. After a moment, I came back to my senses and whispered, even if the heir of Anyang Marquis comes to propose marriage, your servant would never have any involvement with him. In those eyes that had been as dark as night, starlight suddenly flickered to life. My heart ached with reluctance. Forget it. Xie Ziling had always been a man plagued by deep-seated insecurity. When his mother passed away, the late emperor was so overwhelmed with grief that his health began to deteriorate. Later, when court officials rebelled, Xie Ziling had to shoulder the burden alone. Although the former Prime Minister Yan Shueding assisted him with utmost dedication, his overwhelming influence in the court made Xie Ziling wary of him. Upon reflection, I suppose, I might be the only person Xie Ziling could truly trust. I sighed inwardly, hesitated for a moment, then finally reached out and gently embraced him. Xie Ziling stiffened momentarily before hugging me back even tighter, burying his face in my shoulder and softly calling out, honey. Truth be told, Xie Ziling and I were actually much closer during our childhood than we are now. With the bond of childhood sweethearts between us, I never found it inappropriate even when he became the crown prince. Moreover, Xie Ziling was 5 years younger than me, when I was already of maidenly age. He was still a child and didn't pay much heed to the boundaries between men and women. I had always been frail, and at 17, I fell ill with a cold and was bedridden. I secretly carved a camellia from a piece of green jade as a birthday gift for Xie Ziling. The following spring, Xia Xiling rode all the way to the outskirts of the city to gather a full bouquet of camellias for me, saying he wanted me to see the spring outside, but after the late emperor passed away and he ascended the throne, the weight of his responsibilities grew so heavy that it silently pushed us further apart. I was lost in memories when suddenly I heard Xia Xiling's voice. "Does honey miss our parents? This emperor will send you out of the palace to stay at the residence for a few days." Early the next morning, Xia Xiling personally escorted me out of the palace and back to the chancellor's residence. My intuition told me something wasn't quite right, but Xia Xiling's expression remained normal, and I couldn't find any flaws in his behavior. The carriage stopped at the gate. Hand in hand with Xia Xiling, we walked through the central courtyard. Under the banana trees in the sweltering summer heat, we exchanged greetings with my parents. "I shall send the Empress home for a brief stay," Xia Xiling finished speaking to my mother, then turned his burning gaze upon me. "Honey, I shall come to fetch you in a few days." His words were spoken with solemn gravity, as if making a sacred vow. At that time, I hadn't thought much of it, only feeling that Xia Xiling was behaving strangely. I even suspected he might have ulterior motives for sending me out of the palace, but upon reflection, I'd always conducted myself with virtuous magnanimity. Even if he wished to promote someone's rank or bring another into the palace, there would be no need for him to act behind my back. Finally, I attributed this to Xia Xiling's consideration for my homesickness, especially sending me back to spend time with my parents. I stayed at home for 3 days. On the 4th day, while I was carving a piece of jadeite in my room, my father suddenly entered with a grave expression, informing me that the heir of Marquis Enyang was requesting an audience in the main hall. I casually tucked the small carving knife and jadeite into my sleeve and went out to meet him. The sunlight outside the window was glaring. Xiao Jin stood in the main hall wearing a lake blue brocade robe, his hands clasped behind his back. When he saw me, he smiled gently. "Ajin," I frowned slightly. Now that I occupy the position of Empress, by the rights between ruler and subject, the Crown Prince should address me as Her Majesty the Empress. This time, I shall not hold it against you, but do not make such a mistake again. Xiao Jin's expression stiffened. "When did we become so distant?" After a moment of silence, I replied coolly, "Propriety must not be neglected." Xiao Jin remained silent, so I asked him again, "What brings your highness here today?" "I merely came to pay my respects to Her Majesty the Queen at the residence." Xiao Jin curled his lips slightly. "Now that I see Her Majesty is safe and sound, this subject can rest assured." For some reason, I detected a profound note of mockery in his tone. Looking at Xiao Jin before me now, I suddenly felt he seemed somewhat unfamiliar. Upon reflection, it has indeed been many years since I last saw Xiao Jin. During his previous audience at the palace, with just a few words, he managed to sow discord between Xia Xiling and me. This led Xia Xiling to suspect I had an affair with him, while I thought Xia Xiling was truly acting like a child, so utterly immature. Moreover, Xia Xiling had previously told me that remnants of Lord Jing'an's faction were running rampant around Yaocheng. The city of Yao lies extremely close to the southwest fiefdom where the Marquis of Enyang resides. At this thought, I suddenly asked, "Why did you suddenly send me that sour plum drink that day?" After asking, I stared intently at Xiao Jin. Sure enough, caught off guard, a flicker of panic flashed through his eyes. That day I passed by a shop in the capital and saw it. Remembering how you used to love drinking it before entering the palace, I bought 2 cups and had them sent to you in the palace. I smiled faintly. "Is that so?" Perhaps my expression was too indifferent, for Xiao Jin ultimately said nothing more. He merely bowed and took his leave. I watched him depart, then turned around only to discover my father standing behind me, his face grave as he gazed at me. "What's wrong, Ajin? The weather is about to change." The day before I left the palace, Xia Xiling summoned my father to the imperial study. "Lord Xiao has devoted himself to our dynasty, truly a loyal and capable minister, but honey is, after all, the Empress. I do not wish to implicate her." Xia Xiling wrote 2 lines with his brush, then looked up at my father. "Lord Xiao, why not take her home for a short stay first? Once all hidden dangers in the palace are eliminated, I will personally escort her back. Father said that Xie Xialing discovered Consort Li appeared obedient on the surface, but in reality, she was secretly colluding with remnants of the Jing'an Marquis faction and people from the southern borders Li Kingdom, plotting to seize the throne. I thought of Consort Li, who wore a thin red dress in the depths of winter trying to dance for Xie Xialing, and felt deeply puzzled. Could she really be capable of such grand schemes? Father said gravely, from the moment she entered the palace. Consort Li's goal was never to win favor, it was the emperor's life. A sudden ominous premonition arose in my heart. For His Majesty to send me out of the palace like this, Consort Li and her faction must be preparing to make their move. At dusk, the sunset clouds that had originally painted half the sky were suddenly covered by continuous dark clouds, followed by a torrential downpour that cast the entire capital into gloom. I rode my horse at full gallop all the way to the city gates. The Imperial Guard commander was startled to see me and hesitantly asked, "Your Majesty the Empress." I lifted my chin, shaking water droplets from my hair. "This palace mistress has returned." Opened the gates. Even as dusk approached, I could see the suddenly tightened defenses outside the palace gates. If the visible Imperial Guards were like this, one needn't even mention the hidden forbidden guards. When I reached the palace gate, I was already drenched from head to toe by the rain. Xie Xialing saw me, his sharp expression freezing in an instant. A moment later, he snapped out of it and hurried to my side, asking urgently, "Honey, why have you returned to the palace? If I hadn't come back, how much longer did your Majesty plan to keep this from me?" I met his gaze steadily. "Xie Xialing, you've asked me many times what exactly our relationship is. Now I'll tell you. We are Emperor and Empress, husband and wife, and as husband and wife, we should face hardships together. I came back to be with you." Xie Xialing pressed his lips together. "You should stay home properly. I don't need your company." Even at a time like this kid still stubbornly refuses to admit the truth. His eyes had clearly lit up just moments ago. I deliberately turned away. "If that's the case, then this concubine shall take her leave." As I spoke, I silently counted to 3 in my heart. Just as I reached the middle of the third count, a sudden force rushed toward me, tightly embracing me from behind. Originally drenched by the rain, my entire body had been ice-cold, yet when Xie Xialing's arm encircled me, the warmth of his touch penetrated through the thin fabric, traveling upward along the skin at my waist. Fragmented images flashed through my mind, and my face grew slightly warm. Fortunately, Xie Xialing didn't notice. He merely pressed his cheek against my back and murmured in a muffled voice, "Honey, don't go. If you didn't want me to leave, then why did you hide these matters from me and send me out of the palace in the first place?" I asked coolly. "Xie Xialing, do you think I'm untrustworthy, or that I'd be a burden to you?" "Neither." His voice grew more urgent. "Honey, I'm afraid it's not safe for you to stay in the palace." I opened my mouth to speak again when suddenly the grand hall doors were flung open. General Zhou, the commander of the Imperial Guards, rushed in and urgently reported, "Your Majesty, the assailants have broken through the western passageway of the palace." The western side, that was precisely where I had originally arranged for Consort Li's Pine Moon Palace to be located. Xie Xialing, who had been playfully clinging to my back moments ago, immediately straightened up and said gravely, "I knew it. Issue the order. Spare no one except Consort Li and the heir of Anyang Marquis, Xiao Jin." It really was him. Only after General Zhou had left did I turn to look at Xie Xialing. When did Xiao Jin start colluding with the people of Li? Back when the late emperor was already gravely ill, he still managed to issue an edict in his weakened state, sending Lord Anyang back to his fiefdom in the southwest, precisely because he knew of his treacherous intentions, Xie Xialing said. Moreover, before Lord Jing'an's death, he had secretly sent multiple messages to the southwest.
Arrived just in time to restrain Consort Li. I turned to see Xie Xialing pulling the sword from his shoulder, calling out "Honey" with a pale face before fainting. Only later did I learn that Xie Xialing had been carefully planning for days, intending to use himself as bait to lure them into staging a coup, so he could round up all those treacherous officials in one fell swoop. He just hadn't expected to get injured. When Imperial Physician Li came to examine Xie Ziling's pulse, he took the opportunity to bandage the wound on my hand as well. At that time, I had already taken a hot bath, changed into clean clothes, and was sitting by the bed watching over Xie Ziling. Your Majesty has been exhausting himself for days, and his vitality is already weakened. Moreover, the wound on his shoulder is quite deep, he must rest in bed and recuperate properly. After Imperial Physician Li applied medicine to Xie Ziling's shoulder wound, he withdrew. Chunying advised me from the side, "Your Highness hasn't slept all night, and you're injured as well. Why not rest first, when His Majesty wakes? This servant will wake your Highness." I shook my head, "You go and rest, I'll stay with His Majesty a while longer." Chunying couldn't persuade me otherwise and had no choice but to bow and take her leave, as I sat by Xie Ziling's bedside. One thought kept circling in my mind, when exactly had I fallen for him? Perhaps it was the day he filled my bed with camellias. I had been ill, drinking bitter medicine for days, my body racked with discomfort, but Xie Ziling came, carrying the dampness of early spring rain, bringing me a brief yet vibrant spring. Honey, I was lost in thought when Xie Ziling, lying on the sickbed, suddenly opened his eyes. Perhaps because of his injury, his voice was soft. "The words you said in the hall last night, do you still mean them?" I instinctively wanted to deny it, but when I met those eyes that seemed to glow with light, my heart suddenly softened. In the end, I nodded. Xie Ziling was severely injured for several days, and I carefully tended to him during that time, but that morning, I woke up a bit earlier, and when I hurried over, I happened to hear Xie Ziling and Physician Li talking in the room. Physician Li's voice carried a hint of helplessness. "Your Majesty, your wound has already healed for 3 days. Do you still intend to keep it from the Empress?" Xie Ziling coughed lightly twice. "That's none of your concern. All you need to do is come daily to change my dressing and make the situation sound more serious when reporting to the Empress. Is that so?" My anger flared as I stepped through the doorway and said coldly, "How serious is it? Why don't your Majesty and Physician Li explain it to my face?" Xie Ziling was dumbstruck. Physician Li tactfully withdrew. I stood rooted to the spot, not moving a muscle, just staring expressionlessly at Xie Ziling. He suddenly coughed twice, realizing that playing the victim was no longer effective, and quickly shifted the blame. I learned all this from Yan Xinting. Back then, he feigned illness and exaggerated his suffering to win his wife's sympathy. I just picked up a few tricks from him. His voice grew quieter as he spoke, likely aware of his own guilt, until he finally muttered pitifully, "If Honey hadn't been so stubborn and refused to speak the truth, why would I have resorted to such underhanded tactics?" I was so furious I nearly laughed. "And now you're turning the tables on me." Xie Ziling changed the subject. "Would the Empress like to see Consort Li? I ordered her to be captured alive, and she's currently imprisoned in the dungeon. I truly do wish to see Consort Li again. All that effort she put into competing for favor, was it all just an act from the very beginning? If so, her acting skills were simply too impeccable." When Consort Li was brought over by the guards, she was dressed in plain clothes, her face still bearing wounds. The moment she saw Xie Ziling, her knife-sharp gaze slashed toward him. "You tyrant," Xie Ziling scoffed, "just because your rebellion failed, that makes me a tyrant." Consort Li's eyes burned with even greater hatred. "If you had truly treated me as your consort, why would I have conspired with the people of Li? You brought us into the palace yet never touched us. If your heart belonged solely to the Empress, why did you ever involve us in the first place?" I frowned and suddenly asked her, "Did you collude with the people of Li only after entering the palace?" Consort Li fell silent at once. "Stop pretending," I sneered. "Your purpose for entering the palace was never pure. Did you really expect Xie Ziling to fall deeply in love with you, and then for you to abandon your mission for him, so the two of you could live happily ever after? Have you been reading too many romantic novels? You..." Consort Li was furious. "So this is your true face? That virtuous and gentle demeanor before was all just an act to deceive people. So what? You even lied to me, saying the emperor favored virtuous and gentle women." Xiaojun, how can someone as deceitful as you deserve to be empress? Back when she schemed with all her might to win favor, even if it was just an act, there was still something endearing about her. But now, with her face twisted in rage and her voice hoarse from screaming, I suddenly find myself at a loss for words. Xie Ziling took a step forward, pulling me behind him, and said calmly, "What I love is the Empress. Not some paragon of virtue, whatever the Empress is like, that's exactly what I love. After Consort Li was taken away, I still hadn't recovered from the shock. Xie Xiling turned his head and looked at me somewhat cautiously. Honey, are you angry with me? I steadied myself and asked him. Consort Li just said that although you brought them into the palace, you've never touched them. Yes. Then when you went to Consort De's place in Consort Xian's, Xie Xiling curled his lips into a smile. The tea at Consort De's was good, and the snow pear soup at Consort Xian's palace wasn't bad either. Pity neither could compare to Honey's rose-flavored cherries. It finally dawned on me. You were just mooching food off them. Xie Xiling narrowed his eyes, suddenly reached out and pulled me into his arms, laughing with childlike satisfaction. What freeloading, everything in this palace is rightfully mine. I pressed down on his mischievous hands roaming over me and frowned as I asked. But if you never intended to touch them, why did you bring them into the palace in the first place? Xie Xiling fell silent for a long moment. Suddenly, I found myself at a loss for words. To each position, its duties, as the ruler of a nation. Xie Xiling indeed had many things he could not do. Since I ascended the throne at 13, I couldn't even fully trust Chancellor Yen. Xie Xiling buried his face in my shoulder, his voice heavy. Had Honey not entered the palace to accompany me, those days would have been unbearably difficult. I had originally intended to confront him about deliberately sabotaging my 2 marriage arrangements, but suddenly found myself at a loss for words. Xie Xiling truly understood me well, knowing exactly how to act in front of me to most easily soften my heart. When it comes down to it, both he and I are unbearably stubborn people. We had clearly fallen for each other long ago, yet neither would admit it first no matter what. As if whoever spoke the words first would lose face to the other, so I quite childishly maintained the virtuous and gentle persona of an empress, advising him to share his favors equally among the consorts. Xie Xiling, equally childish, used other concubines to provoke me, trying to make me speak first. When the court affairs are more stable, I'll ask for their opinions. Those who wish to stay in the palace, I'll ensure they live comfortably for the rest of their lives. For those who wish to leave and remarry, I'll prepare a generous dowry for each. Honey, is this all right? Xie Xiling spoke with utmost seriousness. While cautiously observing my expression, I pondered for a moment, then nodded. Xie Xiling let out a cheer, hooked his fingers around my belt, and gazed at me with moist eyes. Since that's the case, and it's getting late, why don't the Emperor and his Empress retire for the night? In the midst of my dazed infatuation, I suddenly remembered something and struggled to ask. By the way, ever since you summoned Lady Yen that day, you've been acting strangely. What exactly did she say to you? Xie Xiling paused mid-action, then leaned down to bite my lips. He muttered vaguely. Originally I wanted to learn how Yen Xianting managed to deceive his wife into falling for him, but it turned out to be completely useless. Humph. It seems to me he's nothing special, that Yi Xiuxiu must have been exceptionally naive and easy to fool. I strongly suspect he's just jealous of Yen Xianting. But the atmosphere was too ambiguous for me to expose Xie Xiling, so I could only say, Your Majesty is absolutely right. Xie Xiling then smiled even more smugly and attended to me with even greater enthusiasm. I enjoyed it while sighing inwardly. Little boys are so easy to please.